So here we are once again, another APSA, joy of joy, and Congress is still declining. Indeed, I think it's declining at an increasing rate, to put it in, I guess those are more economic terms, regardless of who controls it, Republicans, Democrats, or some division thereof. You wonder whether there's something maybe larger afoot. It seemed to me that you can't really understand Congress without understanding the relationship between Congress and the modern executive. Indeed, we also need to throw in the Supreme Court for good measure, because they're now involved in lawmaking. How the branches interact, their institutional roles as institutions under the Constitution, and how that has all changed. It seems to me that the decline of Congress is a problem, but in more ways it's a symptom of a larger problem, which is what I'd like to kind of back up and take a deeper look at and relate that to Congress, and that's the rise of modern bureaucratic rule, or the administrative state. Because that seems to me that's the change that's driving this transformation as self-government is being overwhelmed by this new form, this new bureaucratic way. And Congress, having created that thing, is now suffering from its successes. For the American founders, the idea of a constitution preceded, is antecedent to government. Government's a creature of the Constitution. The Constitution was created by a people who constituted, the Constitution comes from a people who then constituted government. A sovereign people possessing rights by nature delegate powers. Those powers are separated and structured in a Constitution, checked and balanced, and that will allow majorities to rule while protecting minority rights. At the turn of the last century, American progressives began to reinterpret that relationship in response to new conditions, as they like to say. Rights aren't understood to be natural, but social and determined by history, and so grow and adapt. There would be a new compact now between the government and the people, and the government would play a role, and indeed the key role, in actually determining those conditions, thus rights, and thus the limits and expansion of government. And so the replacement of rights grounded in nature by history made it possible to replace politics with the rational administrative state. And here I have to give credit and point out the great work done by John Marini, especially in his recent book, Unmasking the Administrative State. He's someone who's thought long about this question, and I want to think about it in terms of Congress, and especially the political branches in particular. As the law became a tool for social reconstruction, government then can become an instrument for progress. So the founders went to great lengths to preserve consent and limit government through republican institutions and the separation of powers. The progressives held that the barriers erected by the founders had to be removed or circumvented. So government could be unified and expanded through the combination of powers, which would concentrate authority and direct its actions towards achieving more and more progress. Politics would remain in the realm of expressing opinions, hence the continued relevance of Congress. But the real decisions and details of government would be handled by administrators, separate and immune from the influence of politics. Hence the separation of administration and politics that's throughout progressive writings. The constantly changing structure of this administrative state requires dynamic management as well, hence their theory of leadership. Footnote Hegel and Max Weber and Woodrow Wilson. So, the United States has been moving down this path of an administrative government, which we've already made reference to, in fits and starts for some time, from the initial progressives through the New Deal expansions. But the administrative state was not really institutionalized in any permanent way until the Great Society and its progeny. Before that time and until that time, America was centrally governed under the Constitution, but was administratively decentralized at the state and local level. When administration is nationalized, it creates a new source of conflict between the executive and legislative branches. So at first, progressives liked to look to the presidency, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, and presidents pushed Congress to expand administrative powers. Congress was reluctant to do so. They remained a defender of decentralized administration. But Congress, seeing the writing on the wall, adapted. And between 1968 and 1978, passed more regulatory legislation than in all previous history, delegating innumerable legislative powers in the form of broad regulatory authority to bureaucracies and agencies and all of those things they had created.
Remarks of the President at a dinner for Latin American diplomats from the East Room of the White House, March 13, 1961.
It is a great pleasure for Mrs. Kennedy and for me, for the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson, and for the members of Congress to welcome the ambassadorial corps of our hemisphere, our longtime friends, to the White House today. 139 years ago this week, the United States, stirred by the heroic struggle of its fellow Americans, urged the independence and recognition of the new Latin American republics. It was then, at the dawn of freedom throughout this hemisphere, that Bolivar spoke of his desire to see the Americas fashioned into the greatest region in the world. Greatest, he said, not so much by virtue of her area and her wealth, as by her freedom and her glory. Throughout Latin America, a continent rich in resources and in the spiritual and cultural achievement of its people, millions of men and women suffer the daily degradations of poverty and hunger. They lack decent shelter or protection from disease. Their children are deprived of the education or the jobs which are the gateway to a better life, and each day the problems grow more urgent. Population growth is outpacing economic growth. Low living standards are further endangered. And discontent, the discontent of a people who know that abundance and the tools of progress are at last within their reach, the discontent is growing. In the words of Jose Figueres, once dormant peoples are struggling upward towards the sun, towards a better life. If we are to meet a problem so staggering in its dimension, our approach must itself be equally bold, an approach consistent with the majestic concept of Operation Pan America. Therefore, I have called on all people of the hemisphere to join in a new alliance for progress, Alianza para Progreso, a vast cooperative effort, unparalleled in magnitude and nobility of purpose, to satisfy the basic needs of the American people for homes, work, and land, health, and schools, techo, trabajo y tierra, salud y escuela. First, I propose that the American republics begin on a vast new 10-year plan for the Americas, a plan to transform the 1960s into an historic decade of democratic progress. These 10 years will be the years of maximum progress, maximum effort, the years when the greatest obstacles must be overcome, the years when the need for assistance will be the greatest. And if we are successful, if our effort is bold enough and determined enough, then the close of this decade will mark the beginning of a new era in the American experience. The living standards of every American family will be on the rise. Basic education will be available to all. Hunger will be a forgotten experience. The need for massive outside help will have passed. Most nations will have ended a period of self-sustaining growth. And though there will be still much to do, every American republic will be the master of its own revolution and its own hope and progress. Third, let us turn to the less developed nations in the southern half of the globe, those who struggle to escape the bonds of mass misery, which appeals to our hearts as well as to our hopes. Both your nation and mine have recognized our responsibilities to these new nations. Our people have given generously, if not always effectively. We could not do less, and now we must do more. For our historic task in this embattled age is not merely to defend freedom, it is to extend its writ and strengthen its covenant to peoples of different cultures and creeds and colors, whose policy or economic system may differ from ours, but whose desire to be free is no less fervent than our own. Through the Organization for Economic Cooperation Development and the Development Assistance Group, we can pool our vast resources and skills and make available the kind of long-term capital, planning, and know-how without which these nations will never achieve independent and viable economies, and without which our efforts will be tragically wasted. I propose further that the OECD establish a development center where citizens and officials and students and professional men of the Atlantic area and the less developed world can meet to study in common the problems of economic development. If we in the Atlantic community can more closely coordinate our own economic policies, and certainly the OECD provides the framework if we but use it, and I hope that you will join as we are seeking to join to use it, then surely our potential economic resources are adequate to meet our responsibility.
Since 1970s, Congress has been reorganizing itself continuously, committees, subcommittees, leadership role, in a way that could oversee and interact with the day-to-day operations of this modern bureaucratic apparatus. Congress sought to develop the powers over the administration. The best-known example of that, which you referred to, is the legislative veto. A good and perhaps ironic example of which is the National Emergencies Act of 1976, intended to control presidents, in particular Richard Nixon, which originally the Congress could override with majority. Supreme Court declares that unconstitutional in 1983 in the Chadha case. But of course, that's the piece of legislation that Donald Trump is using to build his wall, Congress having delegated the authority to him. Over time, Congress has largely focused less on actual lawmaking and more on oversight and bringing regulatory relief from the bureaucracy. Ex post facto legislation, we might call it. When Congress does legislate, it tends to be extremely broad and turns over this extensive power to agencies in various places who, for all intents and purposes, do the things that we would associate with law and lawmaking. Indeed, what goes much for law, or at least the back and forth of lawmaking nowadays, isn't in the legislature at all, by which I mean on the floor where legislatures actually deliberate. It's between the executive and leadership in very closed-door small meetings. But then more interestingly, actually between the executive and various courts fighting over administrative application. That, along with things like the Chevron doctrine, show how deeply engaged the courts are in maintaining not the Constitution, but the administrative process itself. Today, the modern Congress is almost exclusively a supervisory body exercising limited oversight over administrative policymaking. Thus, Congress, which used to be called the keystone of the Washington establishment, is replaced, hat tip John Marini, by the bureaucracy as the keystone of the rational state. Now, all of this has changed how the branches operate. Think of the founders' understanding of separation of powers, the importance of structure. And contrary to the naive notion that bureaucracy is neutral and scientific, it turns out to be hard to keep politics out of politics. And as a result, much of executive legislative affairs and back and forth historically is actually a fight over the control of the bureaucracy. Early progressive presidents had grandiose ideas. FDR did much to legitimize the administrative state. Think of the Brownlow Report, and set it up under the new executive office of the president. Nevertheless, during the first part of our bureaucratic history, Congress had the upper hand. Indeed, executives, especially since 1968, posed the greatest threat to the administrative state, fighting to control and, if possible, diminish it. But by 1984, exactly when party control of Congress changed for the first time in 40 years, about that time, presidents had come to figure out the allure of bureaucratic power. And so as Congress expanded the bureaucracy, creating innumerable agencies, delegating lawmaking authority, losing control of the details of budgeting, focusing on these ex post facto checks, presidents came to realize they could actually use and lead the bureaucracy through a combination of executive discretion, poorly written law, willful neglect and disregard for their own policy ends with or without the cooperation of Congress. And as the constitutional rule of law centered on legislation gives way to administrative or executive discretion, so the administrative Congress of the 1970s and 80s is replaced by the administrative executive of more recent years as the branch that dominates our politics. This seems to be the case where Congress has sold the rope with which they will hang themselves. Having delegated significant legislative powers, they now find themselves far removed from the action. They tried to sustain their power through committees, oversight, but the distinction between general lawmaking and particular execution has been overcome to the advantage of the power closer to the deed, as Machiavelli would say. Thus, it turns out that bureaucracy is a greater danger to legislative power than executive leadership. This Congress, it seems to me, is a reflection of all the same problems, though torn by divides within the Democratic Party. On the one hand, it's still small, petty, no serious agenda beyond omnibus spending. But on the other hand are those vocal members who have been driven more by national ideological debate, something that both the previous speakers have pointed out. That doesn't surprise me given the imbalance of power and Donald Trump. Having said that, it seems to me that Donald Trump has been rather restrained in all this, which is to say he's not pushing the constitutional edge of executive powers as much as he's simply using powers delegated by Congress. Emergency Powers Act is an example. So are the trade powers he's been using. And the feckless precedent of one branch appealing to another to challenge the third, i.e. Congress running to the courts, that of course was a precedent started by Republicans under the Obama administration. So my conclusion to be brief. Bureaucracy can accommodate the executive, and executives, it turned out, can accommodate but also use and direct the bureaucracy. That's quite problematic. Although it suggests to me that it might be and probably is the best option for checking the administrative state and challenging its legitimacy is going to come from the executive and not Congress, even though Congress, at least in theory, should have the powers over the administrative branch or the fourth branch. The larger problem, of course, is that the bureaucratic government is fatal to representative democracy and the rule of law. By here I mean those old-fashioned things passed by Congress. The administrative state, bureaucratic government, amounts to a new form of rule. It's less democratic, less subject to consent, and makes government less representative, and us, as a result, less self-governing. It has transformed and disfigured our constitutional institutions. The separation of powers, weakened as a practical check on the abuse of power, does not work to create any governing consensus of the American people. And together, the political institutions no longer pursue the common good. I am tempted to say that Congress, seemingly oblivious to their own demise, fiddles while Rome burns. It may be excused, as a great scholar said of the new political science in its infancy, it may be excused by the fact that it does not know that it fiddles, and it does not know that Rome is burning.